Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Make Like an Artist with me, Chloe Hogan. I am a museum engagement specialist at the Gibbes Museum of Art, and through this series I want to provide a closer look at the artists in our collection and gain some insight on how these artists actually work. In this video, we'll be talking about black and white photography as inspired by the Robert Marks collection at the Gibbes Museum. You may have seen our recent special exhibition highlighting this collection. In Body and Soul, the figure in modernist photography features some of the most significant and groundbreaking photographs of the 20th century. The exhibition featured 30 of the 155 photographs donated by Robert Marks in 1974 and explored photography's emergence as an artistic medium. At the turn of the 20th century, artists began to embrace photography as an artistic medium with unlimited potential. The Robert Marks collection includes renowned photographers who use the camera for social, performative, voyeuristic, and documentary purposes. From the heroic actions of day laborers atop the Empire State Building, as captured by Lewis Hine in his iconic photo Icarus, to the tensions and anxieties of an acclaimed artist captured in Alfred Stieglitz's Hands of Georgia O'Keeffe, to George Platt Lynes' surrealist-inspired nudes, or Ouija's spontaneously raw depictions of urban nightlife. These photographers captured the figure in a variety of forms and styles, exposing the potential of the modern medium. I'm going to take inspiration from these photographers to expand my own photography practice and create photos in a way which I haven't before. We'll explore portraiture, street photography, documentary photography, and of course I'll be giving you all the tips and tricks I learn along the way. While these photographers were pushing the medium in new directions, they certainly weren't the only ones. There are so many photographers we could talk about. For example, Gordon Parks, whose groundbreaking photographs captured the day-to-day realities of Black America, or James Van Der Zee, who was a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance. It's important to acknowledge that while the Robert Marks collection is vast, it is by no means complete. So to get started on this project, first I spoke with my former photography professor, John Lusk Hathaway. When shooting manually, the photographer has choices to make in terms of exposure, shutter speed, and depth of field. How do these manual settings allow for artistic freedom, or not?
You know, when I'm teaching an intro to film photography class, it slows the process down and it makes the person understand that's learning how apertures and shutter speeds work in tandem to create an exposure, and how those exposures look when actually photographed. Because you can take a photograph with 3 different settings that are proper exposures or equivalent exposures, and each 3 of those are going to look very different in terms of the depth of field, whether being shallow or long, or stop the motion. You can stop or blur motion.
Exposure refers to the overall brightness of a photograph. More specifically, it's the amount of light hitting the film and is adjusted using shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed means how long the lens is open. A faster speed means the lens closes quickly and motion is captured and stopped. With a slower speed, the lens is open for a longer amount of time, thus blurring motion. Aperture refers to the opening of the lens's diaphragm through which light passes. A lower f-stop means a larger aperture and therefore more exposure to the film. With a higher f-stop, there's a smaller aperture and therefore less exposure on the film. Aperture is one of a few factors which determines the depth of field. I wanted to point out that you make this distinction of saying make photographs instead of take photographs. So can you explain why you prefer to say making photographs?
There are certain choices you make before you release the shutter. Where you're going to stand, what's the relationship going to be like with the objects that are in the foreground and to the background. As much as you possibly can, try to imagine what this picture is going to look like before you take the picture. So you're not haphazardly just walking around snapping your environment. I think that's a misconception with photographers, is that they photograph blindly and there's this serendipitous thing that happened and they get lucky. I think sometimes that's happened and you should be open to that when it does. So I think in that way, I think it adds a little weight to photographing to say that you're making photographs.
It's easy to understand how, for example, George Platt Lynes photographs are made with the intention of being art. In the case of photojournalism, where the camera is used as a tool for exposing social issues, would you still consider that type of photography art?
It depends on how you're actually framing photojournalism. I mean, there are certain standards, especially when you're photographing for like the Associated Press, where they want you to be as objective as possible. So they want you to kind of be taken out of the equation. Of course, that's impossible, but they still want you to try to do that. They want you shooting with certain lenses. You can only do so much manipulation in Photoshop and in Lightroom. You're not supposed to crop pictures, so it's a very strict ideal of what photojournalism is. But I do think there are serious artists who are working in a documentary style. Many whom are actually in the show that are most certainly artists. And this is based on a show that the Museum of Modern Art had in 1967 called New Documents. John Zurkowski, the curator, basically said that these artists are photographing in a documentary style, but instead of looking at the world objectively, they're kind of wrestling with it in their own subjective ways. So it's a very subjective, a very personal view of what their world looks like to them through the camera.
The first photographer I will attempt to emulate is George Platt Lynes. Lynes was commercially successful in New York fashion and portrait photography, but his art practice is largely characterized today by his remarkable photographs of the male nude, which he created from the 1930s until his death in 1955. By 1937, Lynes was one of fashion's most successful photographers. His images regularly grace the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. He also made portraits of artists and writers, and was known to create theatrical narratives with dramatic lighting and stage effects. He was at the heart of the bohemian art scenes in first Paris and then New York, and ran with a crowd of gay and queer artists and writers, many of whom he photographed. The circulation of his homoerotic and expressive photographs of the male nude was limited to this circle of friends due to obscenity laws of the time. Lynes treated both his commercial and personal work with what he called the amorous regard. In the case of his male nudes, it was the gaze of desire between photographer and subject, many of whom were romantically linked with Lynes. In his fashion photography, it was a heteronormative fiction created by the model and photographer together in creating this gaze of desire. Desire is, after all, the emotion needed to sell garments. You want in fashion photography to make your viewer pause flipping through a magazine and go buy those clothes. Lynes would use props to allude to a narrative, making his photos all the more intriguing. Lynes also found inspiration in surrealism. His theatrical compositions often place emphasis on symbols, dreams, and mythical narratives. Lynes would juxtapose seemingly disparate ideas and objects to create something new, often posing models in odd, sometimes humorous settings. Lynes photographed at the ballet and was constantly backstage. He attended the opera once a week, and I think that his love for the performing and theatrical arts really shows in the way that he thinks about composing his photographs. So, to create a Lynes-inspired photograph, I set up my studio with some props, including gloves and roses. I used a mirror and a window to create a natural spotlight to achieve that theatrical feeling reminiscent of Lynes' work. Lynes often spoke about the collaborative relationship between the photographer and their subject, so I followed his example of collaboration. My sister Mariah was the model for this shoot, and it was very much a collaboration of both of our ideas. Her poses would give me ideas on new angles to shoot from, and when we began to lose the light, it was actually Mariah's suggestion that we take the mirror outside and try some shots like that, which turned out to be some of the very best of the entire shoot. For this shoot, the concept was a femme fatale. So we wanted to allude to a narrative of a heartbreaker, a femme fatale. So what was important to me in this was capturing Mariah's intense gaze to the camera. Then we used the tool or the mirror to sort of create this distance between the viewer of the photo and the subject, Mariah. And through this, I think it invites the viewer to ponder or question their relationship to her gaze. And I think that this relationship between the gaze of the subject, the gaze of the viewer, and the gaze of the photographer all work in tandem to create the high drama of a George Platt Lynes photograph. I think we captured that dramatic, glamorous feeling characteristic of George Platt Lynes photographs, so thank you to Mariah for helping me out with this one. The next artist we'll be talking about is Laszlo Maholy-Nagy. Laszlo Maholy-Nagy was an interdisciplinary and influential artist. His work is very much idea-driven. Nagy was a part of the early Bauhaus and became the right-hand man to the director Gropius. The Bauhaus movement was expressionist and mystical. The German school was famous for its approach to design, which strove to combine aesthetics and function. Maholy-Nagy started painting on canvas in 1919. In the 20s, he began experimenting with painting on plastics, aluminum, and other materials. He was obsessed with transparency and fascinated by capturing light. So even though photography wasn't super popular at this time, it was a natural progression for Maholy-Nagy to explore. Through photography, Maholy-Nagy was able to capture the world in a new way. He'd climb to the top of the Berlin radio tower and take bird's-eye aerial shots of the landscape below. Or he'd get down low and take photos of skyscrapers from the sidewalk. As a true visionary would, Maholy-Nagy explored the subject matter that really interested him through different mediums. So in his paintings, his photographs, and even his sculptures, you can see that he's obsessed with machinery, transparency, light, and abstraction. I always think it's so impressive when an artist can show their hand through many different mediums. And that's precisely what Laszlo Maholy-Nagy did. And taking inspiration from Laszlo Maholy-Nagy, I resolved to take photos which expressed my personal aesthetic as an artist, paying special attention to the things that Maholy-Nagy was interested in, such as transparency, light, and abstraction. I was consistently fascinated and inspired by shadows of trees or power lines. I wanted to create photos that show the similarities and differences between what is man-made and what is natural. I spent lots of time just walking around and exploring, shooting the things that intrigued me, things I would normally walk past that were revealed as beautiful when the sunlight was hitting just right. I shot from different points of view, like Nagy, getting down low to photograph flowers floating in a pool, or taking aerial shots from above, not all of which turned out. I made some double exposures, and most of those were failures. But what I really learned from emulating Laszlo Maholy-Nagy was not to be too precious with my film, to experiment, because sometimes those experiments paid off in a big way. Other times, they didn't come out properly at all. Don't be discouraged when your roll of film comes back and the photos are out of focus or overexposed. Just take that information with you as you shoot your next roll. Let the medium teach you, and don't be scared to try new things. Now that I feel a little bit more comfortable behind the camera, directing a subject, and following my artistic vision, I'll attempt to make some documentary-style photographs as inspired by Margaret Bourke White. Margaret Bourke White was groundbreaking in every sense of the word. She was Life magazine's first female staff photographer, the first Western photographer allowed to photograph the Soviet Union during the Industrial Revolution of the 1930s, and the first accredited female photographer to photograph the combat zones of World War II. Her contribution to photojournalism cannot be overstated. In covering such important and sensitive topics, Bourke White was passionate about truth. She is quoted as saying, "If you want to photograph a man spinning, give some thought to why he spins. Understanding for a photographer is as important as the equipment he uses. The camera is a remarkable instrument. Saturate yourself with subject, and the camera will all but take you by the hand and point the way." In 1935, Bourke White met the Southern novelist Erskine Caldwell. The couple collaborated on 3 illustrated books. You Have Seen Their Faces, which explored Southern sharecropping, North of the Danube, which was about life in Czechoslovakia before the Nazi takeover, and Say, Is This the USA?, which explored the industrialization of the United States. Something John Hathaway explained in our interview was there are 2 camps of documentary photographers. The first camp tries to remain as neutral as possible, follows strict guidelines, and doesn't edit their photos. The second camp is photographers who insert their view as an artist a bit more. Now, I think this can be done in many different ways. How the photos are composed and created, as well as how they're contextualized. I think that the way Margaret Bourke White contextualized her work within these bodies or series of work, it really shows that she wanted to say something with her photography. So for my take on a Bourke White documentary photograph, I photograph the people that make up my everyday life. My partner, my coworkers, my neighbors and friends. I wanted to photograph them in the way that I see them, as beautiful individuals worthy of a beautiful portrait. I took to the streets to photograph strangers as well, which was something that caused me a lot more nervousness than I expected. About to photograph strangers, kinda nervous. Here's what I learned about making portraits of people in a documentary way. The way the camera is perceived has changed drastically since Bourke White was working. In this day and age, people are a lot more wary of a stranger approaching them to take their photograph. I found a couple of things which helped me get over the fear of talking to and photographing strangers. The reason so many of us are nervous to do this is because of fear. And what the fear comes down to is being told no. So the only way to get over that fear is to just go be rejected. So I spent a full 2 days just walking around downtown and approaching people to photograph. And let me tell you, the first couple of times are going to be definitely awkward, but it gets much easier with practice. As it turns out, most people will be flattered that you want to photograph them. It especially helps to have a reason why you want to photograph them, such as I'm doing a photography project and I'm trying to photograph beautiful strangers. Or I really love the way the light is hitting you, do you mind if I make a portrait? Make sure to approach with warmth, kindness, and humility. Not everyone will want their photo taken, and that's okay. Bonus points if you get their information and promise to send the photos once they're developed. This process of getting over my fear and immersing myself in the world around me, actively seeking a moment with a stranger, something that I'd usually avoid, helped me to notice all the beautiful people around me. A major lesson I learned from trying to emulate Margaret Bourke White is to always have your camera with you. There were so many photographable moments that I missed because I didn't have my camera with me, and I will never make that mistake again. Photography has the ability to capture a moment in time, but it's not always as effortless or lucky as it may seem. Photography is a process which requires collaboration, discovery, and perhaps a little bit of magic. Understanding the different methods and choices these photographers make helped me to understand their work in a new way. I'm used to consuming photos in a way that these photographers could have never imagined. Most photos that I look at are on a 5-inch screen, scrolled past in a matter of seconds, and never printed out. So to shoot film in this digital age is to see the beauty in slowing down, to be careful and methodical in your approach to photographing, rather than taking 30 photos of the same image and uploading them all to the cloud. I encourage anyone out there who hasn't given photography a proper artistic shot, try composing photographs on your phone or any camera. Just be intentional about composing thoughtful photographs and see what comes of it. You might be surprised. Platt Lynes covered subject matter that was considered taboo at the time and is now remembered as a groundbreaking artist. Bourke White broke glass ceilings. Maholinage was confident and clear in his vision. In taking inspiration from these artists, I learned so much, not only about aesthetics and techniques, but also about being bold and confident in your vision as an artist. Thank you for watching this episode of Make Like an Artist. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll be talking about my absolute favorite piece in the entire collection, so it's gonna be a good one. See you then!